Hi, this is Josh Marshall, and this is the Josh Marshall Podcast. We've got a lot to talk about today. A big part of it is something that happened last night. There was a CNN town hall with ex-President Trump, sort of his first go out in the outside of the Fox, Newsmax, OAN ecosystem. And even with Fox, it's one of these interesting things that even Fox has been kind of like a no-go zone for Trump for a long time. And this was certainly the first time his being on CNN in forever. And this is the first time in the Chris Licht kind of era in CNN, and he was found to have sexually abused E. Jean Carroll the day before. I'm losing track of my days here. Okay, so yesterday? Okay, yesterday was the town hall, and the day before was the verdict where the civil jury found that he had sexually abused her and also owes her millions of dollars. Um, they had a range of choices. They chose sexual abuse rather than rape. Again, it becomes a little complicated to say what the distinction is in a civil context, right? But anyway, these are just normal everyday things that happen in Trump world nowadays. He's also facing multiple felony charges in New York State, and then there's the Georgia thing, and everything else under the sun. One of the things that came out of that town hall last night is he was given multiple chances to say, "Would you like Ukraine to win in Ukraine or Russia to win?" And he wouldn't answer. So we're still clearly back in that, Helsinki press conference world of Trump, where 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 he says stuff like that. And of course, the day before, you also had George Santos finally getting indicted. What has it been, like 5 months since this fuse has been burning? And one of the things about two things about Santos. I mean, what a guy, right? He goes and turns himself in on Long Island, Eastern District of New York. There's two federal U.S. attorney districts in New York City, even though, or they're based in different parts of New York City, even though they cover more of the state. And he goes, turns himself in, gets processed, and then he's out like an hour later, trolling on Twitter about Hunter Biden and how he, all this kind of stuff, and the other thing with Santos is, I've been doing this for a long time and looking at indictments of elected officials, and usually they are campaign finance related. They're things that are in some sense bribery, even if they're not quite labeled that way. These are the range of things. I've never seen an indictment of an elected official that had unemployment insurance fraud as one of the indictments. And what I saw another lawyer, another legal observer point out is that in most of these indictments, there's one overarching scheme. There may be multiple crimes, but it's one overarching scheme. And in this case, you have three totally unrelated schemes, just multiple different kinds of criminal behavior. So that is going on, and it's of all of that, they still couldn't get justice for that dog Sapphire. Remember, he raised money for this dog. I believe the dog didn't have cancer, but had a tumor, like an invasive tumor, that needed to be removed, or the dog would die. And he raised a few $1,000s, then he kept it, and the dog died. So there was no justice for Sapphire. But I mean, what a usually when you actually get indicted, either you come to the conclusion on your own or your lawyer convinces you, like, time to stop shit posting, get off Twitter, right? Or say something very innocuous. But that was not where he was. Let me tell you before we go any further. Our colleague Kate is going to be away for a couple weeks. So our plan for the moment is next week we're going to have an evergreen episode. We're going to talk about some really interesting news stuff, but not stuff that is right on top of the news the day we record. And then we'll probably have an off week the week after that. So just heads up that is coming. Before we get any further, let me remind you that the Josh Marshall podcast is brought to you by Grady's Cold Brew Iced Coffee. Now's the perfect time to stock your pantry for peak iced coffee season with Grady's New Orleans style cold brew. Grady's will ship a 6-pack of bean bag bundles right to your door so that you can enjoy refreshing cold brew iced coffee for a fraction of the price you'd pay at the coffee shop. The bean bags are the easiest way to brew it yourself. No special grinders, gears, strainers needed, anything like that. For less than $1 a cup, it'll give you a smooth start to iced coffee season. Get 25% off at Grady'sColdBrew.com with promo code TPM. Again, that's Grady'sColdBrew.com with promo code TPM. And before we get started on the Trump show, just for transparency here, I was not able to watch it live last night. I was actually helping my son study for an AP exam. That's talk about, life stage thing. Anyway, that was what I was doing. But I have caught up. I'm going to watch it later today, but I've, kind of caught up on a lot of the details and the clips and reactions. So, you know, I didn't watch it, but what is it? I stayed in a Holiday Inn Express last night, so it's close enough. Was it you who didn't? Someone I was talking to a little while ago who had never heard that reference before. But I stayed in a Holiday Inn Express last night. Anyway, uh, Kate, what was your reaction to the show last night?
Well, okay, so this is something that we all knew was going to be some degree of a disaster, right? Because we've just been through so many iterations of this where people are like, no, we just need a different interviewer and this will go different. And then you have a whole slate of different kind of, big names in journalism and it always goes exactly the same way. And this time was particularly egregious because the crowd was comprised of registered Republicans or undecided independents. So it essentially created a laugh track for everything that Trump said. I mean, it was bizarre. There's the part where he's talking about the assault on E. Jean Carroll, which he was just found liable for on Tuesday. And he's doing that thing he does where he's narrating what happened from her perspective and then breaking in with observations as like an outside observer, so kind of toggling back and forth between these roles and doing what he's been doing throughout this, making fun of her, appearance, doing this really weird thing where like he can't seem to comprehend that when this accusation and the accusation of the other women that was kind of testified in that trial, that when accusations happened decades prior, the women making them were decades younger at the time. He like cannot seem to figure that out. He keeps referring to E. Jean Carroll as like she was an older woman when this happened, even though the accusation is from the mid 90s. But anyway,
And for
so the
clarity, they're both basically the same age.
yeah,
Like
she's 3
she's
years older
maybe
than
2 years.
him.
Yeah, exactly,
Yeah.
exactly.
And so it's just bizarre because he is kind of going on this, uh, like playing it for laughs, right? Playing this rape accusation for laughs. And Caitlin Collins is sitting there trying to kind of intercede, but it was as if she was placed to kind of play the role as like the uptight, prudish woman who just like doesn't get Trump, is not fun enough to think he's funny, like, is a political correctness police just like ruining our good time. So she's just kind of like sputtering inefficiently while he's delivering this story and the crowd is roaring with laughter. They think it's absolutely hilarious. And that was just the way that it went. They loved when he was mean to Caitlin Collins, when he called her a nasty woman. It was just basically a Trump rally sans the merch is what they
Right.
put on TV. And then you have, CNN afterwards saying like, well, Caitlyn did a terrific job and blah, blah, blah. And here's the thing, like the crux of the debate, I think, is what do you do with Trump? Because he is the Republican frontrunner. That's just the truth. You can't reasonably ask journalists not to cover him. But the thing is, you cannot just give him an open mic night because there's no journalist in the world who has proven themselves able to fact check just the spew of stuff that comes out of his mouth, because a lot of it is not even like fully formulated sentences. Sometimes he just kind of gestures in one direction and whiffs off onto another tangent. It's just no one has proved able to do it. And as the night went on, Caitlin Collins just kind of gave up, like stopped fact checking him. By the time he got to the point where he was saying that people can like quote unquote abort, babies who are already born for months. I mean, she didn't even say anything. And so all of this was by design, right? I don't think CNN or anyone else actually thought that they were putting Caitlin Collins in a position where she was going to do what no one else has been able to do and fact check him on air, and that he would get embarrassed maybe or be shamed into, like, come on, we've known this guy for years at this point. They thought it would be good for ratings because you have the combination of kind of, big Trump super fans, and then also the majority of people who are, going to hate watch or watch to tweet about how bad it is. And it's also this kind of self-contained machinery where CNN wants to be reporting the news, but also wants to be making the news so they can be the first ones to report it. So, the post coverage is just like trying to make all these kind of individual newsy moments within the bigger context of the town hall, and then that's news, and then that gets reported on, but it's all coming from the same like CNN super machine kind of thing. So ultimately, I'm sure if the ratings are good, CNN will be thrilled. I'm sure they'll do it again. And these are the same kind of corporate journalistic carrots that run counter to the interests of democracy.
Yeah, I mean, normally, if you are doing a town hall with a candidate for the nomination of one party, it makes sense to have the audience be people made up of that party, or independents who lean in that direction. That makes perfect sense. They're not, Democrats are not the audience in a primary, in a nomination primary context. But obviously, that's not really what it is, because Trump's the guy. Trump is the nominee, even if we don't want to say it yet, right? He's the head of the Republican Party, and you only have to you only have to know him, that of course it's going to turn out that way, that he's gonna he's gonna make it into a rally. I'm curious whether they I'm not sure how I'm not sure how they should have gone about that, because if you said, all right, we're going to get half Trump supporters, and we're going to get half Trump Republican skeptics, right? Well, that would mean you're going to have to fill it with the 2% of Republican Trump skeptics, right? That's that's not a real that would be sort of like if you had this in a Democratic context, you're going to say we're going to get half Democratic supporters of Social Security and half Democratic Social Security skeptics, so we have some balance. Well, that's not balance, because you can't find any Democrats who it's kind of the same thing. So I don't, I there's a couple of thoughts I have on this. One is that CNN wants ratings, yes, but what is their real aim at the moment, their kind of strategy, is to rebrand CNN as not too liberal. That's the thing. That is their audience levels are not really their problem. They've got a pretty big audience. And even when Fox's audience was much better, CNN made more money just because who their audience is, the kind of advertising you can get. You're with Fox, you're having all of these sort of like, put your 401k in gold. Here's the best self lubricating catheter. It's all like aimed at a certain audience. These are not premium advertisements that you get like big dollars with. So what Chris Licht was brought in to do was, again, make it no longer be too liberal. Well, you can get into sort of an abstract debate. What's liberal? What's too liberal? None of that matters. What they're really trying to do is get Republicans to stop attacking CNN, because a substantial minority of the country sees CNN is the Clinton News Network. It's fake news CNN, and that is a big problem for CNN. CNN is not a niche news organization. It's supposed to be a mass buy-in news organization. It has to at least have a shot at the audience participation of everybody. And if they're blackballed by almost half the population, that's a huge problem. So what they're trying to do is get Trump and Republicans to stop saying CNN is bad. Now, if that's the standard, you can see that goes in a pretty bad direction. And I think if you understand how this stuff works, if you understand Trumpism, if you understand, how Republicans have functioned with the press for 30 or 40 years, this isn't a case where you're Chris Licht and you're going to sit down with Trump or sit down with Mitch McConnell or McCarthy or something, and they're going to say, Chris, we've got these 3 things that really get on our nerves. If you can just stop doing those, we're all going to be pals again. That's not how it's. They in that world, there is the obedient press and there's the enemy press. You can't. There's no set of disagreements or set of complaints. And the whole point is to get media organizations into a supplicant posture vis-a-vis Trump. And that's exactly what they're doing here. So it's not even, that is what they want to do. But what you actually have is you have to keep doing that forever and then Trump will make fun of you. And his supporters will mock you because you're a supplicant. And in Trump's world, there are dominators and supplicants, and you're a supplicant. So, I think it is always important to step back and think, even if he is sort of dominating this show, that doesn't mean that he's helping himself politically. I think that's a basic disconnect that a lot of well-meaning press commentary has fallen into. I mean, he was president. He dominated everything for 4 years, and then he lost. So what the impact is, I don't know exactly, but I don't know what they were, what the suits at CNN were thinking, but you're right. Probably they think it's awesome.
Yeah. I mean, so the other piece of this is there were specific moments that I think Democrats have already kind of zoomed in on as useful for them, right? And these were the moments where Trump was genuinely like kind of tripped up. That was, I think, his wishy-washiness on Ukraine, Russia. He just kind of, I mean, we know he loves Putin, right? Like that's not a surprise, but Caitlin Collins kept kind of pushing him, like, do you want Ukraine to win the war? And he wouldn't answer and wouldn't answer and wouldn't answer. And it just, it was kind of like uncomfortable in a way, that it was just really clear that he was trying to dance around it. There was that. There was his attempts to kind of walk a line on a national abortion ban, trying to sound a note that he's open to it. but, without going like all the way into kind of embracing, Lindsey Graham's 15-week ban. And that's going to be interesting because the Susan B. Anthony Pro-Life America organization is like one of these kind of big anti-abortion groups. And they have said, they kind of came after Trump when he said the court did the right thing by leaving it to the states. And they said that they won't endorse anyone who doesn't publicly support a 15-week federal ban. And now they've already kind of softened that position because I guess they had
Because
some like
Trump's going to be the
cleanup meeting.
nominee.
Right. And they had some cleanup meeting with Trump, and they were like, oh, he is the most pro-life president of our time, whatever. But that is going to be a problem that's going to hound the Republican primary. And it's interesting that the only kind of recourse there is trying not to answer the question. So you have Ukraine, you have abortion, and then the other big moment was the documents case that is still being, special counseled by Jack Smith, where he wouldn't say that he hasn't shown anyone the documents. That's a moment that you can tell is getting clipped and transcribed right into the court documents. And is you could see it all over his face. Like his face dropped, like he got kind of sullen and pouty and didn't want to talk about it and was like, it's fine, I can declassify things with my brain. So those were kind of three, I think, standout moments that weren't just him kind of like vomiting lying word salad and having the audience like cry tears of joy, which might actually be helpful. But the thing is, like, fundamentally to me, you have to cover the Republican frontrunner. Like, I don't argue with that. But giving him a home crowd, that was a choice. And that they knew that was going to mean that he was getting the kind of de facto approval of the audience stand-in. And that is the part that I think quibble with most from last night.
Yeah, it is telling from what you say that a national abortion ban, that's hard for him to,
Mm-hmm.
because he's the most pro-lifeiest president in history, but he's also paradoxically, he's not an idiot. He can see that it's really toxic right now in national politics. So he wants to stay away from it. Russia, he's sort of dancing and everything. Um, uh, Everything, and obviously the things that might send him to jail, he's dancing on. But the one thing that he can really get into and really tell a good yarn and get his people, whooping and hollering is when he rapes someone. I mean that there's only, they found it was sexual abuse. I mean, the difference between sexual abuse here and rape is not the same as we may recognize today in ordinary conversation, right? It can have very specific physical meanings, whatever. But the point is, when he was forcing himself on a woman, that's something he can joke about and really get everybody in a good mood. I mean, that it's sort of obvious, and yet you say it and it's pretty jarring. And as you say, kind of narrating it from her point of view, him coming in, I wouldn't touch her, she's not my type. And also, did she come in a wheelchair? What's the story? You think I'm getting down with a woman that, just that's him, and that's his language. And just the way of making it a fun story. There's no other way to put it.
Yeah. And let's just do like kind of a quick kind of summary of how that case ultimately went. The jury turned around its verdict under 3 hours after they were given the case, which is interesting because it was kept anonymous throughout the trial, literally because the judge was like, Trump will direct violence to these people if we don't keep them a secret. But it was 6 men and 3 women. So just kind of off the bat, I was like, oh man, you look at the dismal, this wasn't conviction, but the dismal conviction rate for kind of crimes of sexual abuse in this country. And it's easy to think you also have the added layer of he was a former president and maybe some people will feel uncomfortable. And the accusation, happened a long time ago. But it was just a pretty resounding victory for E. Jean Carroll here, found liable for sexual abuse and for defamation. has to fork over $5 million to her for damages. And just, I mean, the details from the case are just, they make him look so bad. The moments from his video deposition where he was like, she's too ugly for me to rape. And then he mistakes her for his ex wife, Marla Maples. The whole Trump's lawyers were, not like they put up any kind of defense, but what they did do was what people always do to victims of sexual assault, which is if there's any kind of hole in their memory of the specifics of the incident, that renders them not credible. And I thought Carroll's lawyers did a really good job by kind of countering that during his deposition by asking him when his various marriages started and ended, and he had absolutely no idea, like kind of a rough like 5 to 10 year ballpark. Um, and it is one of those things where I think if she had lost, that would have been crushing, because all of these kind of cases, whether they involve Trump or not, these women are being stand-ins for, the hundreds, millions more who have experienced behavior like this, but who don't, say anything for good reason. So
Well,
anyway,
probably
I
the
think
hundreds, literally hundreds more just by Trump.
but it's by Trump,
Right,
exactly.
right, right.
And the other piece of this, not to get all West Wingy about it, but this lawsuit was only possible because activists in New York had pushed for this law that would basically kind of toss out the statute of limitations for a 1-year window and give victims of sexual assault the chance to file a civil suit, even if, the assault had happened years and years before. And that's what she used to file this suit ultimately.
But she would have still been able to sue for defamation, right? Or
Right.
not?
That's right.
Okay. But she basically, this basically allowed her to like sue for the rape equivalent of when someone sues for wrongful death in a civil
Yeah.
context where you get money damage. Basically, I mean, sounds weird to say, but wrongful sexual abuse, and so you owe damages, and
Right.
he lost on both. Although I guess what the judge gave three basically versions of sexual abuse that the
That's right. Yeah.
jury could choose from, I guess.
And the other piece of this is we sometimes get into this posture with Trump that's like nothing that happens to him will matter, because his base is so fanatic. And it's like, that's true. His base is that fanatic. But as we've seen, he needs more than his base to win an election. And what we've seen in particular is just the bleeding of women who used to vote Republican from that party, in no small part because Trump is its standard bearer. And those kind of voters, this is the kind of case that they are going to understand, because it's not complicated. It's not about, you know, government documents and their correct handling. It's not about a kind of guy to guy hush money link chain to this woman. It's flat out. It's easy to understand. There's no like legal complexity here. And I do think that stuff matters, even though we're always in this place of like, Trump is a juggernaut. It doesn't matter, even though now he's had so many more losses than wins. But I do think that this kind of thing matters, and that getting a spate of headlines where Trump is, a jury found him liable for sexual abuse is just a lot more than nothing.
Yeah, no, I think I think we're constantly in this thing where people are endlessly frustrated by the fact that anything could happen. And what is it? 20% of the population, again, 20% of the population isn't the same as 20% of the voting population, but 20% of the population, it doesn't matter. Anything, it doesn't matter. But as you say, he needs substantially more than that to win an election. And one of the things I was struck by in watching, parts of the hearing about, the deposition, certain parts of the trial, et cetera, is that it's one thing although I think it did not do him any favors in terms of the jury, in terms of the results of the trial. But when you're saying like, yeah, she ain't my type, I'm not touching that. Like, you hear that and you're like, okay, dude, that's not a conversation about whether you did it.
Mm-hmm.
That's like that. uh, That is, I think, for most people, that is really jarring because it's not. I mean, if someone is accused of rape and you want the person to save themselves in your estimation, right? In your sense of, is this an okay person? Could this person, not have done this terrible thing? You want to say, I did not do that. I remember that. I remember the time. What she said did not happen. I did not do that thing. And obviously people who did do it say that all the time, but you want to hear that because that is how, if you didn't do it, you were going to talk. You're not going to kind of, that sort of song and dance is, I hear that and you're like, okay, you did it. like obviously you did it because you're joking about it and you're kind of demeaning her in sort of kind of denying it, not, it's like OJ kind of stuff. Like, if I did it,
Right.
if I had raped her, here's how I would have done it. I wouldn't have done it like she said, just,
Mm-hmm.
and politically, I think that is, in some ways, that's almost worse than the verdict for him. People get reminded of that. You're like, dude, and I even think in what I've seen of this town hall yesterday, and I think I saw the Biden Instagram account put something out like right afterwards to this effect of like, do you want to go back to this? Do you remember this?
Mm-hmm.
Do you remember this? Do you remember how fucking crazy this was and how fucking exhausting? And this kind of crazy person who, yeah, is sort of a bundle of energy and impossible not to look at. But do you remember when we kind of lived with this crap like nonstop? And I think that's a pretty powerful thing for a lot of people. And not
Yeah.
that necessarily you win, but I think everybody has that sense of like, that was exhausting. That was totally exhausting.
Yeah, and then the other piece of the Eugene Carroll verdict was how Trump's opponents would react, right? His primary challengers or prospective challengers, and I mean we've been talking about this on the show, but it's just they're so stuck because they're doing this constant thing of trying not to alienate Trump's voters while also having to make the case for why those voters should pick them and not Trump. And that leads to like just the weak ass responses that we got. Like DeSantis was like, well, I've been pretty busy. There's a lot of stuff in the news, but I've been pretty busy. And it's like, okay, while Trump is kind of like going after him night and day, is that supposed to look tough? And then you have Nikki Haley being like, we need to leave behind the negativity and the baggage. And it's like, okay, cool. So that's our Republican option for women, right? And then you kind of go lower on the totem pole, and you have like Larry Elder tweeting out all the names of women who have accused, like Bill Clinton of sexual misconduct, and then Vivek Ramaswamy who's saying, this race would be much easier for me if Trump wasn't in it, but we don't weaponize the legal system against our political opponents in this country, So it's like it's all variations of being pro Trump. It's just like more vocally pro Trump to more like, nah, I don't know. I'm going to run away from this question pro Trump. And
Well, it's
then,
sort. Go
I was
ahead.
going to say
Go
the
ahead.
only outlier obviously is Asa Hutchinson, who said, this is more kind of like indefensible conduct from Donald Trump. And I'm sure that kind of pleased the five, Lincoln Project dudes who are like super stoked to vote for him.
Well, it is telling that only one of the gadfly candidates kind of went there. That with Alvin Bragg, you can say Soros, far left wing, radical prosecutor, coming and weaponizing it against Trump. But as much as people are around Trump are kind of dumping on Carroll, you can't just say like radical far left Soros rape victim. Good going. Just it's you can't really, I mean, you can say it's not true. Sometimes accusations are not true, but and they, I guess Reid Hoffman was basically footing the bill for her to bring this case. I think it was Reid Hoffman. In any case, a very a billionaire plutocrat type was picking up the bill, and so you can say, oh, it's not her hit job, but it's hit job of the Democratic woke mob and all this kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, you can see from what the responses were that that option was just not there. You have to kind of say, oh, I didn't hear about it, or like, that's very negative. Can we leave that in the past? It's just not a prosecutor. A prosecutor is not a victim,
Right.
by definition, and you can go after them. That's part of. If you want to go after a prosecutor, you can. You shouldn't. You can't incite violence against them, but you can criticize them. That's our system. You have free speech. You can. You don't have to. You don't have to like them and all this kind of stuff. But it yeah.
So now we're transitioning into George Santos's indictment, which perhaps like the least shocking news of the past few years. Almost shocking in that we were like, what's it gonna be? There's such a wide swath of stuff to choose from. But basically the kind of the big crux of it is the campaign financy stuff, which is that he told supporters and potential supporters, kind of give me money, this will fund my campaign. And then with the barest effort to cover his tracks, just rooted that money right into his, direct bank account to use it for, buying clothes and paying off debts and whatnot. And then attached to that, lying to the House of Representatives on his financial disclosures. And then that he committed some light unemployment insurance fraud during the pandemic, which is like, pretty hilarious. But I think almost what gets me about this indictment is that like doing campaign finance crimes is so easy in America because our entities that are supposed to police it are the IRS, which the Republican Party has systemically defunded and basically made completely powerless in the past few decades, and then the FEC, which is now almost always deadlocked and powerless for that reason. And with the Supreme Court decisions, it's just kind of the wild wild west. Like, you don't have to do that much to do kind of shady money laundering that is legal under our kind of sham of a regulation, but he couldn't even take those steps. Like, he hardly did anything at all except just kind of wire transfer from this one account to his personal account, I guess not knowing that wire transfers can be traced. And per the indictment, they have him on, in emails and in text messages basically admitting that he wasn't going to use the money for his campaign, which, we'll see if they have enough to really like nail him to the wall here. But it's just like, this is the one area of, well, there are multiple, but this is an area of crimes where you can basically like get away with anything, particularly if you have a good enough lawyer. And this is the one that got him like stapled to the wall because he's such a freaking doofus.
Yeah, I mean, there are, as you say, there are ways to substantively commit crimes under these legal regimes that make them almost impossible to, what you do is you say, okay, we raised it for our campaign. Our campaign made a donation to the Friends of George, and the Friends of George hired my nephew, and my nephew bought my groceries for the next 2 years. And that's is that illegal? That's a tough thing. But yeah, if you just say like, I just raised this money, it's in my campaign account, let me wire $100,000 to me. Like, you actually can't do that. You actually cannot do that, and that's a pretty serious crime. And it's funny though that in some ways I feel like it's almost unfair to him, since he had a lifetime of operating this way, it with total impunity. So like, he wasn't he's like one of these kids raised by wolves, right? He had no experience of the law and legal accountability, and suddenly it's being sprung on him in his mid-30s, right? It's almost like it's not fair. I do wonder. There's certainly, I mean, they basically got him on things tied to his campaign, uh, the unemployment insurance fraud that happened, when he was between his campaign. So that's kind of campaign related. Um, there certainly seemed like he was involved in a lot of other scams and crimes in the last few years. I'm curious whether I mean, they may have thought like, and I don't know exactly how many years he's facing, but they may have thought like, that's a lot of work. There may be some issues with statute of limitations, and it's those are complex, and this is not complex. We have sort of got him totally dead to rights, so we don't need to do that other stuff. And I don't mean I kind of joking that it's too much work, but you're involved in credit card scams and stuff like that. The witnesses are also scammers, and there's those things are messy, and this is not messy. I mean, kind of like you can't just like literally take the money.
Right. I mean, and in their press release, they said that, if he's kind of nailed on all the top counts, that is a 20-year prison sentence. So I'm sure to some degree there's like, this is not a frivolous thing that he's being charged with here. And he is to some extent just like a really kind of low grade con man. So getting him on this feels like, okay, that's substantial, right? It's a kind of wide swath of stuff. Some of it makes him just look like a really bad person on top
Right.
of this. Um, and so now we're back to where we always are with George Santos, right? Which is the political dynamics remain unchanged, e.g., that McCarthy needs his vote because the margins are so slim. So I'd be surprised if we're facing a situation other than he is going to be there until he is shackled.
Totally. And one thing that is important to keep in mind is that we talk a lot about how campaign finance laws are so toothless and stuff. And one of the key things is that it is not a defense per se, but it gets you pretty far, both on whether charges are even brought and then what happens in a punishment phase. And that is basically, I didn't know. Or like, if you're a campaign and there are a couple straw donors in there, the candidate says, hey, we had, 5,000 donors. We've got people who do this, people who do that. I didn't know that. And like, yes, it's on me, but there was no ill will here. I didn't, how was I to know this was happening, that was happening? And that is why there's lots of campaign finance stuff that can be pursued civilly or criminally. And in the vast majority of cases, it's just pursued civilly because you don't have to worry about what I just described, which is I didn't know, it wasn't on purpose. There's so much going on, all that kind of stuff. More or less in a civil context, you just say, hey, it happened. And there's a fine, and that's the end of it. And even when it's brought in a criminal context, you usually have that thing of like, hey, I was out there on this, giving the speeches, doing this. Yes, some bad stuff happened, and like maybe I'm ultimately responsible, but I didn't decide to do anything bad. And that can be a convincing argument. And often that's why, okay, you get like even at a criminal level, you get a fine, or you get, sentenced to 3 months of house arrest. But when you just take the money, you find out that often the actual criminal penalties are pretty stiff. It's just that you don't get to the criminal penalties in a lot of cases because of all those things I described. So even things you can say like, oh, the campaign finance system is toothless. Like, it is toothless unless you're operating at that kind of brazen a level where prosecutors say like, okay, we're actually going to totally indict you for this and try to get the max. I mean, you don't get the max because, I mean, shockingly, I'm not sure he has a criminal record. He's had a million times when police like questioned him, but I don't think he's ever been, not in this country at least. He's not
Yeah.
been indicted. But judges have a lot of leeway. I think they're going to look at him and say like, yeah, you haven't done time in this country, but who are we kidding? Right. You've you've probably committed enough crimes to, and I guess they can actually, I don't know, there are some contexts where you can bring stuff like that in. In any case, he's got
No,
some hard sailing ahead of him, I think.
it is funny that this indictment came from a jury, right? And can you imagine trying to assemble a jury pool that is not like have preconceived notions about George Santos? You are literally gonna have to find people who like don't have an internet connection or something.
No, I do wonder. I'm sure they are going to, because it's not sure about this, but in general, it's not a when you are trying to pick a jury, you're trying to pick a jury who hasn't formed opinions. It's not, the prosecutors can't say, well, of course everybody's formed opinions because he's fucking George Santos and he's guilty of everything. So you should have thought of that before you became George Santos. You can't actually say, I mean, you can say versions of that, but you can't say that. You still have to find people who can say like, yeah, I've heard this, that, and the other, but I have an open mind. Because who could have an open mind? It's
Right.
George Santos. So I'm sure they will have there will be some challenges bringing finding a jury, but they'll figure it out. They'll make it work.
The other piece of this that I find so weird is like you would think, barring everything else, that George Santos is kind of an interesting person, right? Like, interesting is the nicest word you can say about it, but he's had quite a life, There's a lot of color in there. But I swear to God, every time I hear him speak or he like tweets or whatever, you're just like, oh my God, it's just the most like boring, predictable kind of like right wing stuff you could expect. It's like what you were saying, how afterwards he was just like, well, Hunter Biden. It's like, okay, creative George, like interesting. It's just it's just he seems so kind of like one dimensional for someone who is, Tom Ripley
Right,
basically.
right, right. Well, I guess it's at the moment, I mean, he needs to, it's not just ego and adulation. He needs to keep the Trump world on side, right? He needs
Yeah.
not to get kicked out of the House. A potential future pardon from Trump. I mean, who are we kidding? I mean,
Yeah.
I if I were him, that would be my angle,
Mhm.
or just to have one or two jurors who are just Trump people, So yeah, it's pretty weird stuff, and
Yeah.
I do wonder, that's always the thing that is a bit of a bummer on the entertainment front is that politicians wisely go dark when they're indicted. I mean, you're not going to hear anything from them, but I don't think we're going to have that with George Santos. I think he's going
Yeah.
to be, you know, out and proud.
If nothing else, we've seen that he doesn't really seem to be surrounded by like top-notch lawyers, so probably not.
I really
Uh,
wonder, like, would you want to, like, it's not even that he's so guilty. It's that that's very hard for a lawyer when you have an out of control client like that. That's tough.
Maybe you'll start making calls to the people who do Trump's cases. They've got experience with that.
Exactly, exactly, exactly.
So
Okay.
we're going to finish up with
Yeah.
a little debt ceiling corner, which we've been talking about a lot, which is still uh, a, a looming crisis. They had the kind of big four meeting at the White House with Biden and the congressional leaders. The Republicans came out and said, nothing has changed. And I think you did a few posts on some comments that Janet Yellen made on one of the networks, which had
CNBC, I
some
think.
right, which had some kind of like tea leaf reading involved. If you want to kind of break that down.
Yeah, so she went on CNBC and gave a sort of interview that covered general various economic topics, and she talked about the debt ceiling at the top. And what she said was the first thing that I saw that gave some indication of what their plan is when this thing goes over the cliff, which I think it almost certainly will. And she talked about basically prioritization, kind of like what will, I think the phrase was something like, what will we do with the revenues we have? Because remember, the federal government brings in tons of tax receipts on an ongoing basis that cover maybe like 80% of all spending. I can't remember exactly what it is, but it's the great majority of it. So you can service the debt obligations, you can pay for most things, and some things don't get paid. And that she described as one of, as seemed to be the, the first thing that they would do. But then she talked about, all the other options, and we have many options, but they're all bad options. And a lot of people took that as, well, okay, they're all bad options, so you can't do them. But that's not what I heard. I heard them saying, we've got a lot of options. We have lots of things that we can do here. So that struck me as the first time they are trying to prepare people that this is going to happen. And yes, we're not going to get caught flat-footed when it does happen, because we have lots of things we can do, and we're going to do those things. So it seemed like a pretty significant development to me, even though it wasn't necessarily treated that way. There's some stuff that has happened subsequently where, Joe Biden said this thing about, well, I'm thinking about the 14th Amendment thing, but like it would take so long to litigate. I don't think it's practical. And that was a pretty bad sign, since the whole point of doing that is basically to stick it on the Supreme Court. Like, of course,
Mhm.
there's no time to litigate it. And that's the point, that you just do it. And then you basically say to the Supreme Court, like, if you want to kind of take the step to not, you know, not send out people's Social Security checks, Supreme Court, go for it. And I don't think they will go for it. But the idea that you're going to preempt yourself and not do it because, oh, it's going to take too long to litigate, that was the most disappointing, worrisome thing that I have seen in this whole debt ceiling cycle. It was the first thing, and it's one comment, so maybe it was an offhand comment that I'm interpreting in ways they didn't mean, but it was the first comment that made me really think, like, okay, maybe they're just not up to this. So that's kind of where we are right now, I think.
Yeah, I mean, the next thing is that the Big Four are going to meet again on Friday. It's interesting because I think a big kind of beltway theme here has been, is McConnell going to kind of step in because he has been the big part of these things getting resolved before. And I think more to the point, people just realize that McCarthy is like pretty dumb on top of being pretty weak. And like at least McConnell knows what he's doing to some degree. Um, but it's almost funny how aggressively McConnell has been like, this is not my problem. This is the House's problem. Which we talked about on the pod before, but you know, doing this little press briefing, you can also just tell the kind of like energy between McConnell and McCarthy that, they don't like each other. Because, McConnell gets up there and is like saying almost nothing, but saying, a default is not on the table, right? That's not going to happen. And then McCarthy's like, I don't know. We'll see. Stay tuned. It's just kind of like the the degree to which McCarthy is has his career just like built on this like house of people pleasing cards and no other kind of talent other than greasing the palms he has to grease is just so evident in this situation.
Yeah, I mean, I was struck by, I think that a lot of official DC is thinking, now that after McCarthy was able to get that bill through the House, then they were kind of hoping that wouldn't happen. And then this whole thing would go away. And I'm talking about people in the, corporate world and financial services and kind of just inside DC people. Maybe McCarthy will just belly flop and this whole thing will go away. And then when he got it, they were like, okay, Biden, you've got to negotiate because we can't let this escalate anymore. And I think people are thinking the thinking there is, all right, Biden, give him, unspent COVID money and give him this, that, and the other. They're not that big a deal. Just you got to do it because because you got to be the grown up. But before McCarthy went in there, you had all the Freedom Caucus people saying, he's got, our knife is at his throat. He knows he's got to get everything. He's got to overturn the Inflation Reduction Act. He knows he has no room for maneuver. And, even McCarthy, if you listen to him, has basically been saying in so many words or in body language, just negotiate with me. Just give us something and we can move on from this. Something, but you are never, I'm never going to be able to give you a clean debt ceiling. That is never going to happen in this space-time continuum. So just give me something. And the gulf there is just so big. I mean, just see the whole thing is I at this point, I have no idea how this is going to get resolved. But it's, just the whole thing is a train wreck, even more than it was obviously a train wreck a couple weeks ago.
It really is. I just keep kind of waiting for like a short-term extension type thing, which obviously the White House doesn't have a really good reason to enable Republicans to kind of regroup
Drag it
for
out.
another
Yeah.
month.
Yeah.
But I mean, when faced with the option of kick the can down the road for a month or two or explode on our debts right now,
You kind of have
might
to.
seem a little more appealing.
Yeah.
Just because at this point, I mean, we are barreling towards the end date. And I know Republicans are saying oh, well, Yellen's not right. It's okay, maybe not, but maybe she is. And this is a pretty weird thing for her to be, to assign her some kind of resistance lib motivations for. So, I mean, at this point, we're weeks away. I mean, the time in the space that both chambers of Congress are even in and working at the same time is reduced to days. It's just, I don't know how this gets resolved at this point because as we've discussed, the two parties kind of incentives are just completely different. I mean, it's not one of those deals where it's we just need to find some common ground. It's one party is rooting for exploding the economy and the other one is not. I mean, there's no common ground between opposite things. So yeah, I don't know. That's why I just keep kind of waiting to see if they do end up punting it, just because there doesn't really seem to be any other option than default, at this point.
Yeah, no. And I think that, I think that's right. And there's no, yeah, there's no motion. So I like I said, I maybe that will happen. That you just have an extension to kind of push it back a little bit, just because I would, the White House has no incentive to, as you said, let the Republicans regroup and find a way to more efficiently stick it on the Democrats.
Mm-hmm.
But if you do have in front of you kind of all right, we can get a reprieve for, it's going to be pretty tough for, I think, the president to veto that. And with Yellen, yeah, maybe as you said, maybe she's a little off, but that's sometimes when I kind of think about, maybe there's something about the Earth's ecosystem that warming actually won't be that bad, maybe. But that's not much of an argument. That's not much of a plan. It might not be quite as bad as you think. Isn't much of a plan. But there we are, and I really don't. I can seldom say that I mean, it's not that I know the future, but I generally have an outline of the future that seems more likely than the other, right? Okay, I think this is happening. In this case, I really have no idea. I have no idea where this is going.
Yeah, and I think the biggest complicating factor is just this idea that it's kind of impossible to tell how aggressively prepared Democrats are for this. Like you quoted that Biden quote as worrying to you because it was kind of wishy-washy and kind of like, this isn't going to be a foolproof plan, right? Which kind of sounds like he's not sold on it, right? At the same time, you've got the idea about the discharge petition and all this kind of stuff. But part of the incentives there are going to be for the White House and congressional Democrats to like keep these cards close to their vest because there's no reason for them to reveal their contingency plan at this
Yep.
point.
Yep.
So that is what makes everything so much muddier. Is just you have no idea if the Democrats are actively being kind of complacent and just like waiting to see what happens, or if they do have a plan B ready that we're just not privy to at this point.
Yeah, and I think that that this is one of the things that I think politicians often lose sight of this. And when Biden made those comments, I think he made them on Tuesday. When Biden made those comments, and I wrote to some people who were kind of, Biden adjacent, for lack of a better word. And I was kind of like, what the fuck? Like, what the fuck? Like, what is going on here? And I think that people, politicians often are not sensitive enough to the fact that you can't say something that is going to make your supporters question whether you're even in the game. Like you can say, maybe they've totally got a plan, and they're thinking like, okay, whatever, he said that thing, but we got a plan. Don't worry about it. You don't know our secret plan, but like you can't demoralize your own supporters because you need them to be there with you, and you need them to trust not that you're going to win every fight, but that you're going to show up for every fight. Or this is I think we talked about this in the last podcast. One of the sort of the fundamental things in politics is you can't leave your supporters thinking, am I a chump? Am I out here saying we're going to stand tall, we're not going to put up with this, and like you're not there, or you're actually just going to, or you haven't thought this through or something? That kind of trust is so key in politics. And not only should you not let down your political supporters, but you shouldn't give them too many reasons to worry that you're going to do it. And again, a politician, people are naive if they think their person is going to win every fight. But they want to think that they're going to take seriously every fight, and that they're going to show up at least with some plan, even if it doesn't work, right? And I do worry. I worry right now about the Biden White House in that respect. So hopefully we'll see more in the coming days that will put Josh's mind at ease. But seriously, that will, because again, I don't have a sense of where this is going right now. It's kind of gone back to being a bit of a black box to me. So we'll see. Anyway, right. I think that's it for us this in this episode. And remember, our co-host Kate is going to be away for a couple weeks, much deserved vacation and all that kind of stuff. And we will be back next week with an evergreen episode. So we'll have one for you next week, and then the following week we will have an off week, and then Kate will be back after that. We'll be back to the same old great Josh Marshall podcast content. Let me remind you before we sign off, Josh Marshall Podcast is brought to you by Grady's Cold Brew Iced Coffee. You can get 25% off any purchase at Grady'sColdBrew.com if you use the promo code TPM. Any sign-off comments, Kate?
Nope.
All right. That makes sense. All right. We'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye. The Josh Marshall Podcast is hosted by me, TPM reporter Kate Riga, and TPM founder, editor-in-chief Josh Marshall. The show is produced by Jackie Wilhelm. Thanks to Why Not Jansfeld for our podcast theme song, and thanks to all our TPM members who make this possible. Rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, and subscribe wherever you listen.